After this module, you shall be able to know what is cognition, learn causes of tilts in the process of cognition, identify various types of cognitive biases, and evaluate the mitigating strategies of cognitive biases. Cognition, acquisition, and use of knowledge. Cognition can be conceived of as the process by which sensory information can be used, stored, reduced, elaborated, transformed, and recovered from its application to daily life activities. It encompasses the course of how information is acquired and way it is used. Hence, acquisition and application appear to be at the nucleus. Thus, the implicit process of sensation, attention, perception, thinking, learning, memory constitute the cognitive capacity of an individual. Knowledge about the world resulting from such processes further leads to the affective component of how does one feel about the world. Both the cognitive and the affective components in alliance then generate behavior. With this premise, field of cognitive psychology stands in close opposition to the behaviorist school. It asserts that rather than observable behavior to be studied, the internal mental states giving rise to such behavior should be deeply investigated as the subject matter of psychology. The term cognitive psychology was first propounded by American psychologist Ulrich Neisser in his book Cognitive Psychology. It was thus conceived as a branch of psychology that dealt with cognition or higher mental functions. The basic premise revolved around how humans process information, the mediating internal processes between stimulus acquisition input and response output. As a part of the larger domain of cognitive science, cognitive psychology establishes strong interdisciplinarity with other fields such as neuroscience, artificial intelligence, linguistics, etc. Cognitive bias. A cognitive bias is a pattern of deviation in judgment that occurs in particular situations. Implicit in this concept of deviation is a standard of comparison. This may be the judgment of people outside those particular situations, or may be a set of independently verifiable facts. They appear to be replicable errors in human reasoning leading to consistent skewed judgment. The presence of such biases has been verified empirically in the field of psychology, and its widespread influence is also viewed in the disciplines as well. Certain biases are presumably adaptive as they lead to facilitation of the decision-making process. Many of others result from limitations of information processing abilities, mental confusion, or merely social influence. Such judgment errors are viewed to completely distort and produce systematic errors in the decision-making process. As a victim of such biases, the decision makers sweep from the optimal decisions and depreciates the utilization index. It is inferred as a person's tendency to make errors in judgment based on cognitive factors and is a phenomenon studied in cognitive science and social psychology. Forms of cognitive bias include errors in social perception and attribution, selective attention, decision making, etc. Such cognitive tilts immensely challenge the reliability of lawful support. The mental errors resulting from simplified information processing strategies should be differentiated from other biases that are embodied in culture, organization, politics, or the self of the individual. Thus, cognitive tilts are then not a byproduct of any emotional or motivational vulnerabilities, but rather mental predispositions. It more or less resembles an optical illusion, where the awareness of the illusion also does not reduce the strength and probability of bias. Various psychological efforts are in the area of assessing such biases in the laboratory as well as the natural settings. The assessment of such biases reveals relative rather than absolute nature of judgment aberrations. It connotes that in a group, essentially all members will not exhibit biased judgment, but rather most of the judgments would be by and large affected by the predominating biases in the group. It thus gives more weight to temporal stability than internal consistency. Such biases are believed to be buttressed on mental shortcuts such as heuristics, algorithms, or rules of thumb. Causes of cognitive biases. Researchers in the field of cognition have attempted to understand the nature and cause of cognitive biases. Considering the debilitating effects of information processing tilts, it becomes imperative to delve into the origin of such biases. Traverse and Kahneman reveal that biases may emerge from three basic heuristics such as representativeness, availability, and adjustment and anchoring. Besides these, other potential reasons are also delineated. First, representativeness. The tendency of an individual to discern on events which seem to be representatives of the parent population and depict similar characteristics. The overestimated likelihood of events based on their greater representativeness leads to various judgment biases. Generally considered as a heuristic, it emerges from insensitivity to sample, configuration, and also underestimation of prior probabilities. Second, availability heuristic. It refers to the ease with which illustrations of particular mental phenomenon emerge in the mind. As an example, if people are asked whether R as an alphabet appears more in the beginning of the word or as the third letter, the most common response favors words beginning with R, whereas in reality, the number of words with R as third letter is more than words initiated with R. Such response emerges with effortless working of the mind. The recall is completely facilitated with easy availability of the mental content, which further seriously affects estimates of risk. Third, anchoring or adjustment. Another cause of cognitive biases is the tendency of an individual to rely heavily on a particular piece of information while drawing conclusions. The act selectively abstracting or just anchoring to some traits and further adjusting the evidences to conform with the plausible anchor emerges as the cause of cognitive tilts. The decision-making process undergoes serious contamination effects as a result of implicit adjustment to erroneous anchors. Fourth, cognitive economy. Many of the cognitive biases emerge from limitations in information processing. Shortcuts used to evaluate probabilities such as availability or representativeness lead to judgmental errors. In various cases, deviation in judgment occurs as a result of deficits in actual processing of information. The tendency of the individual to economize cognitive efforts in terms of time and effort may result in skewed probabilities. Fifth, cognitive traffic. Another potential reason for cognitive biases is the cognitive traffic or mental noise. It refers to the cognitive mess which may cause aberration in information processing. Such cognitive confusion may be due to the load of multitasking and processing, as a result of which the individual may resort to cognitive economy and may not be able to adequately process all the available information. It could thus appear as mental traffic and lead to various psychological and social biases. Sixth, social influence. Social dynamics well influence the cognitive process. Being a part of the group, various pressures such as groupthink, conformity, compliance operate on the members. The conformity to such pulls and pushes may lead to development of a rigid ideology which perhaps may act as an anchor, and all the decisions perhaps be adjusted to the anchor. For instance, with groupthink, all members may be different towards the same cliché perspective and emerge with hazardous decisions. Cognitive biases, thus emerging from social influences, many times become chronic and almost act as affliction to the group. Seventh, prior hypotheses. In various cases, it has also been observed that people may have their prior hypotheses about relation between certain variables. This may lead to selective attention towards the available information and ignorance of other worthwhile information. The focus on limited targets and perceived expectancies may result in skewed perception of the environment and problem at hand. Eighth, estimate of outcome probability. Great body of literature reveals that estimates of outcome probabilities are generally ignored as a part of decision-making process. The decision makers tend to outweigh the value of possible outcome than the gravity of it. This may lead to anchoring of decision to certain key values than its relative magnitude. Analogous to this is the tendency of the decision maker to view the problem as unique, and hence prior hypotheses also become irrelevant. Thus, negligence of the statistical data and insensitivity to validity estimates strongly influence the reliability of the decisions. Ninth, perceived control over situation. Perceiving control over situation may result in illusion of manageability. Such a feeling perhaps manifests in two ways, where firstly the individual may perceive probability of success higher than failure and then perceive greater control of the situation. This can also be viewed as optimistic bias, where positive illusions may be created first, the success and manipulation ignoring the inherent risk in the situations. Post-decisional control, where the individual may feel that decisions can be corrected, reversed after they are taken, may act as serious threat to the decision-making process. Types of cognitive biases. Patterns of deviation in the thought process may lead to errors in the judgment. The tilts in cognition begin with the biases at the sensory stage itself and may intensify to psychological and social level as well. First, sensory biases. Various sensory biases predispose an individual to maintain status quo and avoid cognitive investment in thoughts outside the realm of direct experience. As humans, we react to the information that is received by 5 sense organs and filter events falling out of the sensory domain. Biases at the sensory level operate when sensory organs and the cognitive machinery reacts in a way to perceive real threats and ignore abstract or vague information. The bias to perceive negative information is stronger than positive, and also if it is a first-hand information rather than secondary sources such as newspaper or television. Sensory biases thus focus our attention on real threats and shield it from abstract or hypothetical threats. Second, psychological biases. Research in the area of cognitive psychology reveals important role of psychological biases in maintaining the status quo. Convenient mindsets are sought as a result of psychological biases. Such biases at one place preserve the cognitive investment in dealing with experiences outside the cognitive realm and at the same time also explain the failure in decision-making process. First, positive illusions. Also referred to as optimistic bias, it refers to the tendency of an individual to exhibit over-optimistic view of own ability, control over future events, discounting the evidences for the possible impediment. This may lead to an individual's overconfidence of the own self and vulnerability to risk. Such illusory optimism may be attributed to the precursors such as ambiguity in situation, lack of feedback, anticipation of threat, and have been cited to be major cause of policy failures and disasters in politics and economics. Second, fundamental attribution error. It refers to a bias in explaining others' behavior. According to this bias, when we try to see causes of others' behavior, we tend to overemphasize the role of predispositional factors while ignoring the potential situational factors. The major causes of such attribution error could be more interest in others' behavior, poor communication, lack of self-confidence, negative experiences in past. For instance, if we happen to view an accident, we happen to attribute it to the carelessness of the driver than the situational cause like poor lighting over the street or fault in the car, etc. Third, hindsight bias. Also termed as "I knew it all along" effect. It refers to the increased likelihood to see the past events as predictable at the time when it happened. It relates to the tendency to see greater predictability of events that have already occurred than when they had not taken place, which may also be viewed as exaggerated view of anticipation and foresight. Such bias causes the individual to rely too heavily on the knowledge acquired from previous events and accept inadequate explanations of the same. Fourth, cognitive dissonance. Contradictory information disturbs the psychological equilibrium, and as a result, individual tends to select and organize conflicting data to accommodate with the pre-existing views and beliefs. Another likelihood of the individual is to deliberately avoid the discrepant information so as to reduce the cognitive dissonance. The common reasons for such inclination could be strong ideological motives, commitment to a given policy, inability to adapt to new information, and strong threat to interests, etc. Fifth, in-group or out-group bias. It refers to the common tendency of the people to have a favorable view of in-group members and an inferior view of out-group members. It is the process by which group members seek self-esteem from their comparisons with the other group inmates. Possible explanations for the biased perspective could be perceived intergroup threat and lack of communication among the group members. Sixth, attention bias. The tendency to focus on a particular set of information while ignoring the other relevant information is called attentional bias. It relates to the likelihood of our perception to be affected by our internal recurring thoughts. Attentional bias have been viewed to occur in various disorders such as depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, or eating disorders. In case of depression, selective attention towards negative information, whereas in case of OCD, discriminatory attention towards object of obsession, and in realm of eating disorders, selective attention towards food related stimuli in comparison to neutral stimuli clearly reflects attentional bias. Seventh, memory bias. The impairment or facilitation of recall or alteration of contents of memory refers to memory bias. It may get manifested in the chances of information being recalled or the time taken to recall or alteration in the contents of recalled information. There are various types of memory biases such as false memory, which is misattribution where an imagination is mistaken for memory, illusionary correlation depicting inaccurate remembering of correlation between two events, or humor effect where presence of humor may facilitate the memory of events. Eighth, confirmation bias. The tendency to selectively choose, interpret, focus on and remember information so as to confirm already existing notions is called confirmation bias. Such predisposition aims to field search for disconfirming evidences and to favor existing beliefs and theories. Also, ambiguous evidence is interpreted as supporting existing beliefs or theories. This kind of bias in decision making may lead to reflexive loop where a flawed decision may influence what we observe, which in turn further leads to another erroneous situation. It takes a reverse view where the decision has already been taken and now evidence to support the decision needs to be gathered. It may also act as major precursor of groupthink in the organizations. Ninth, affect heuristic. It refers to the way in which subjective impressions of good and bad influences the decision-making process. It is potent to create perceptual judgments and systematic biases. It is a mental shortcut facilitating decision-making process based on current state of emotions. The tactic is specially relied upon while judging cost benefit of act, event or person, depending on the positive or negative feelings that people associate with them. If the individual's feelings towards an activity are positive, then greater is the likelihood to judge the risk as low and benefits high. On the other hand, if the feelings depicting are negative, then the risk is perceived higher than the benefits. First, actor-observer effect. It is an extension of fundamental attribution error where the dispositional factors are overemphasized in explaining others' behavior, whereas external, situational factors are strongly recommended while attributing the cause for self-behavior. It is the likelihood of individual to attribute own behavior to situational factors such as limited choices, priorities, competing concerns, etc., and others' behavior to dispositional causes such as characteristics, personality traits, intentions, etc. For instance, people are more likely to view national policies and changes in light of administrators' vested interests, whereas own behavior as responsible citizen limited by situational barriers. Second, egocentric bias. It refers to the tendency to see own self as both cause and target of another's behavior. The individual perceives own self at the epicenter to the events in the environment. It primarily involves two aspects: A, tendency to organize memory in context of self, and B, to view own self as cause and effect of others' actions. It manifests when one thinks of the world from his perspective only and refuses to consider the other people's viewpoint. Third, halo effect. It deals with the likelihood of the observer's evaluation of a person to be completely influenced by the impression formed in his mind. The term was propounded by eminent psychologist E.L. Thorndike, referring to the person being perceived as a halo. It is also used in brand marketing, where one positive characteristic of an item also positively influences the marketability of a larger brand. Fourth, self-serving bias. It refers to the tendency to attribute own success to the dispositional causes and failures to external factors. It aims to enhance self-esteem by protecting the ego from threat and injury. To illustrate with a common example, students generally attribute their successful performance in exam to their hard work and preparation, whereas a failure in the exam to tough question paper or strict checking or poor teaching. Fourth, belief in just world. It states that an action of an individual is followed by morally fair and deserved consequences. It purports that people tend to believe in a just world in which everyone gets what they deserve, whereby all noble actions are positively reinforced and bad deeds are punished. Such a belief enables them to justify misfortune, thus serving important adaptive functions. As a result, people are motivated to explain injustices by their belief in a just world. Fifth, projection bias. The tendency of the individual to assume that others also share same beliefs, thoughts, attitude as one has nurtured in own self is referred to as projection bias. It is the likelihood to assume that others also share same emotional states, values and beliefs as one does. This type of bias operates very commonly in daily life when we see our friends more likely to be similar to us than actually they are. A major impact of this bias is that individual fails to recognize the true actual thoughts and beliefs of others and remains in fictitious world of perceived similarity. Sixth, false consensus effect. It refers to the tendency of an individual to overestimate the degree of others' agreement with their viewpoint. This type of tilt operates because we think that our opinion and beliefs are appropriate, therefore others should also be sharing the same. A very common example of the same could be to believe that others should also believe that cleanliness is important because we believe in that way, or believing that every marriage should be essentially followed by having children, as procreation is the only goal and consequence of a marriage. Seventh, bystander apathy. It refers to the tendency of the individual not to respond to the emergencies on the road or in the environment when being in a group than individually. It occurs as a result of diffusion of responsibility where one assumes that other people standing there will resume with responsibilities and take charge of it. Also, pluralistic ignorance emerges where emergency may not be perceived in first case, and if it is perceived, all may feel that others are there to handle the situation. Finally, in many cases, the victim may be left out without receiving any help. Organizational biases. An organization can be defined as collection of people working towards common goal. Various organizational biases emerge as a result of inertia, groupthink, vested interests, promotion stunts, sunk costs, etc. Bureaucratic policies model of decision making is generally used to explain the failure in the decision making process. The judgment errors in organizations can be generally attributed to various implicit factors such as internal policies, centralization of decision making power, anachronistic belief, maladaptive expectancies, etc. One of the major biases predominant in organizations is that of groupthink, where entire group may be directed towards rigid form of thinking and may not be able to break conventional ties. Such conformity to decision without critical evaluation may result in irrational or dysfunctional decisional outcome. Decision-making biases. The process of decision-making refers to series of steps involved in choosing the right alternative as a solution from varied set of possibilities. Biases generally creep and alter the decision-making process. This may arise as a result of lack of objective parameters and more room for subjective interpretations. Biases in decision-making can act as divisive forces as they often lead to compromised results in terms of ideal outcome. They aim to interfere with the rationality of the decision and also vary in nature as are considerably numerous. Many times they tend to disrupt logical contemplation of decision by introducing various externalities potentially relevant to the task at hand. Important known manifested in biases in decision making process are as follows. First, base rate fallacy. It refers to the phenomenon of ignoring the available statistical data and selectively dealing with specific data in order to outweigh probability judgment. It encompasses overlooking the generic data or base rate and giving more importance to the case related data. A reject to the holistic view of the situation leads to calculation error and disrupt the judgment. It leads to jumping down on the conclusion while ignoring all the relevant data in favor of specific data, thus relying more on initiative thinking than rational thinking. Second, gambler's fallacy. It relates to the tendency to overestimate the possibility of an event to occur in failure if at present it has occurred less than the normal frequency or underestimate if it has happened more than expected period of time. A classical example would be flipping off the coins, where if one receives head 5 times consecutively, then probability of receiving a tail 6th time is overestimated. Third, illusory correlation. The term as propounded by Chapman referred to the tendency to inaccurately perceive a relationship between two unrelated events. An everyday example could be to perceive any boy and girl being together as romantic partners where they could just be friends. Similarly, to draw a relation between pain and weather. This generally happens when people pay less attention to the general data and focus on relatively small observations. Fourth, negativity bias. A memory bias where the individual tends to have an enhanced recall of unpleasant memories than positive or neutral memories. It deals with propensity to attempt to learn from and apply negative information while making decisions. It entails that negative events dominate in the conscious experience than positive memories. A classical example of negative bias While going on a road, we tend to recall the accident position if encountered than remembering most of the neutral moments when we have crossed the road, normally without viewing any accident. Fifth, framing effect. It refers to the incoherence, inaccuracy in decision making and a strong precursor to rationality debate. It deals with drawing different conclusions from an information depending on how the information is presented. In simple terms, if the information is presented with gains, then it may elicit positive judgment. In contrast, when it is reflected with negative frame, it may lead to harsh judgment. In both the cases, rationality is challenged, which should form the base of any decision-making process. Mitigating cognitive biases. Severity of cognitive biases in processing of information and producing judgment errors has been well recognized. The persistence of such tilts pose a great threat to the decision-making process. To mitigate such effects, attempts have been directed towards challenging the maintenance of underlying cognitive biases. The profound impact on the process of negotiation warrants instant focus on mitigating strategies such as follows. First, metacognitive awareness. The insightful awareness of the presence of judgment errors and its impact in the decision-making process may help in reducing such biases. A way suggested is to look it at as with impersonal involvement in order to have an objective view of the same. With metacognitive awareness, regulation in terms of monitoring and control may also emerge. Second, review of past. While making decisions, it almost becomes imperative to critically review the events of past. An objective overlook at previous experiences and engagement with the process of decision making may neutralize the anticipated biases. Also, with the review of past, a persistent pattern of deviation may also be identified. Third, hypothesis testing. Putting the implicit assumptions to explicit check and testing its validity would perhaps combat functional fixes. The technique focuses on treating dysfunctional thoughts as hypotheses which is subject to criticism by rational argument and refutation by empirical evidence and thereby correcting the unproductive thought process. Reconfiguration of group dynamics. In an attempt to reduce cognitive tilts, it is at times essential to diversify group members in order to break the groupthink. The diversity of the thought process can protect the group from being a victim of such biases. Presence of multiple unconventional cognitive paradigms can also enhance creativity in decision-making process. Fifth, receptivity to alternative views. A prerequisite to make cognitive process impartial is to allow space for alternate solutions. Receptivity to alternate perspective, especially from an outsider, can really highlight neutrality in the decision-making process. But at the same time, the vested interests of the consultants and other external factors such as their pay or comfort should not contaminate the objective judgment. Sixth, increase of cognitive exposure. The foundation of cognition lies on construction of schemas and beliefs system based on experiences. Increasing the availability of information from various sources and putting it to critical analysis like a devil's advocate may help in combating the cognitive skewness. The exposure to wider cognitive field, carefully avoiding the information overload may help in mitigating such biases. Seventh, cognitive bias modification therapy. Recent trends have focused on CBMT as a novel set of treatment modality aiming to change cognitive processes. Also referred to as applied processing cognitive therapy, as it focuses on cognitive training, interpretation and imaginary modifications. Summary. Cognitive bias is a pattern of deviation in judgment occurring as a result of tilts in information processing. There are various causes of cognitive biases such as relying on heuristics, cognitive traffic, social influences, anchoring to prior hypotheses and perceived control over situations. Cognitive biases can be categorized into various types such as sensory, psychological, social, organizational, political, and judgmental. Remediation of cognitive biases can be achieved through increasing metacognitive awareness and exposure, receptivity to alternative views, testing of hypotheses, and use of cognitive bias modification therapy.